If popular mythology is to be believed, the discoverer of New Zealand was a Polynesian voyager named Kupe. Oddly, this myth was Pākehā in origin rather than Māori. Māori came to embrace it solely as a result of its widespread publication and dissemination in New Zealand primary schools between the 1910s and the 1970s. One version of the narrative sequence that David Simmons characterized as the Great New Zealand Myth went like this. 950 AD, the Polynesian navigator Kupe discovers New Zealand. Between 950 and 1150 AD, Moriori people arrive in New Zealand. 1150 AD, the voyages of Toi and Whatonga lead to first Maori settlement. 1350 AD, the Great Fleet of 7 canoes arrives in New Zealand from island Polynesia. After the fleet came, fighting ensued between Maori and Moriori. Some Moriori were killed, some intermarried with Maori, and the remnants escaped to the Chatham Islands. The Kupe part of this sequence was told as follows in the Department of Education's school journal in February 1916. Kupe lived on the island of Tahiti, though his father was a Rarotongan. His canoe was named Aotearoa, and, in addition to the crew, it carried Kupe's wife and daughters. The Aotearoa was accompanied by another canoe, the Tawirirangi, commanded by a chief named Ngāhue. For many days there was no sight of land to gladden their hearts. Weary and worn out by the long voyage, and faced with starvation, they eagerly scanned the unbroken horizon. At last, Kupe's wife, after gazing fixedly over the sea, exclaimed, "He au! He au!" A cloud, and pointed to a distant white cloud, such as sailors often see enshrouding the land. Cheered by the hope that shone in his wife's eyes, Kupe seized the steering paddle and directed the prow of his canoe towards it. As he drew nearer, it rose higher and higher. Able to read the signs of the sea as they could read the faces of their children, the voyagers now felt almost certain that they had reached their goal. Aotearoa! Aotearoa! The white cloud! The white cloud! They shouted as they strained at the paddles, forgetful of all their weariness. Then, beneath the fleecy whiteness appeared a dark streak of bush-clad hill and valley, and they knew that before them lay the land they had seen in their dreams, and for which they had braved tempests and faced even death itself. It was as Aotearoa that New Zealand became known those long centuries ago. Kupe called the North Island Aotearoa, the long white cloud, and today Europeans who love to keep alive the old names will call New Zealand Aotearoa. It is not difficult to see why the story was embraced with enthusiasm by those very Europeans directly appealed to in the school journal story. It was an inspirational account of the discovery of New Zealand. It gave names, Kupe and Ngāhue, to Polynesian navigators who would otherwise be nameless. In its full elaboration through a series of adventures around the New Zealand coast involving Moa, greenstone, and a fight with a giant octopus, the saga gifts New Zealand a founding myth every bit as majestic as the stories that Pākehā settlers carried with them from Europe, Jason and the Argonauts, the labours of Hercules. Its telling was part of a process that fitted Māori tradition into the cultural patterns of late 19th and early 20th century Pākehā New Zealand, which was looking for stories of resonance and nobility to make the human occupation of the country seem more deeply rooted and worthy of pride than it might by virtue of its, at that time, rather thin European heritage. All that is understandable and excusable. And, one might add, that same account became a source of pride for Māori and an antidote to the concurrent and widespread view that Tasman and Cook discovered New Zealand. As myth, then, the Kupe story worked well and had much to commend it. The problem that late 20th century scholars had with it, Māori and Pākehā, is that, as told here and as compiled by its progenitor, amateur ethnologist Stephenson Percy Smith, the story had no sound basis in Māori tradition. About half the tribes in New Zealand have Kupe stories, but they are by no means congruent and can, in fact, be divided quite distinctly into East and West Coast versions. In areas where he does figure, Kupe is a contemporary of the ancestors of the major canoes and located about 21 generations ago, or in the 14th century AD. The Kupe of authentic mythology was not always associated with the name Aotearoa, and in more than one version of the story, Aotearoa was given as the name of his canoe. The Smith version of the Kupe story and its dissemination in the school journal and other literature, and the title of the first widely read general history of New Zealand, William Pember Reeves's The Long White Cloud, 1898, all popularized and entrenched the notion that the Māori name for New Zealand had been and still was Aotearoa. After decades of repetition, Māori themselves came to believe that this was so. And because shared mythology is ultimately more pervasive and more powerful than history, it became so. In fact, in the pre-European era, Māori had no name for the country as a whole. Polynesian ancestors came from motu or islands, and it was to islands that they gave names. The North Island was known to them principally as Te Ika a Maui, the fish of Maui, in recognition of the widely accepted belief that the land had been fished from the depths of the ocean by Maui Tiki Tiki a Taranga. A small number of tribes knew the island as Aotea, though this was also the name given to Great Barrier Island, and as Aotearoa, most commonly translated, as in the Kupe story, as Land of the Long White Cloud, but perhaps more properly rendered as Land of the Long Clear Day, or the Long White World. The second Māori king, Tawhiao from Tainui, called his kingitanga bank Te Pēki o Aotearoa, thus favouring Aotearoa as his preferred name for the North Island. The South Island was known variously as Te Waka a Aoraki, the canoe of Aoraki, the ancestor frozen in stone and ice as the highest peak in the Southern Alps, and as Te Wahi Pounamu, the place of greenstone, and Te Wai Pounamu. Stewart Island to the south was Rakiura. In the Māori world, all these names would persist in simultaneous usage until around the middle of the 19th century. From that time, some Māori and Māori publications began to favour Nutirani and its variants, transliterations of the words New Zealand, and conveniently applying to all the islands that would make up the modern nation-state of New Zealand. The Treaty of Waitangi of 1840 and its 1835 predecessor, a Declaration of the Independence of New Zealand, used these forms. Apart from Tawhiao's bank operating in Waikato in the 1880s and 1890s, few Māori opted for Aotearoa. In the early years of the 20th century, however, with the growing circulation and popularity of Stephenson Percy Smith's version of the Kupe story, Māori use of the term Aotearoa to refer to New Zealand as a whole increased, especially in oral culture. By the 21st century, it was entrenched as the Māori name for New Zealand, though many South Island Māori, favouring Te Waipounamu as the name for their own island, recognised Aotearoa as a name for the North Island only. The conclusion that a historian might draw from the foregoing is that it is highly likely that there was a Māori ancestor called Kupe who sailed to New Zealand from island Polynesia, but he certainly did not travel at the early date specified in the Smith story. It is also unlikely that he was the discoverer of the country, but the number of place names associated with him, particularly in the Hokianga, Mercury Bay and Cook Strait regions, make it probable that he was one of the earliest ancestors of the Māori to leave descendants and therefore memories in those parts of the country. And finally, New Zealand was certainly not known to Māori as Aotearoa in the pre-European times. Just as certainly it is called that now by most Māori of the modern era. The story of Toi and Whatonga, also compiled by Stephenson Percy Smith, concerns a Tahitian chief and his daughter's husband, who in the middle of the 12th century AD became separated at sea by a storm and then set out to look for each other. Toi, the chief, ended up living in Whakatane among the Moriori people who had landed in New Zealand after Kupe's voyage. Whatonga found him there. The eventual settlement of these two men with their entourages in the Bay of Plenty was described by the purveyors of the myth as the first permanent habitation of New Zealand by Māori colonists. An examination of Smith's sources in the 20th century revealed that the story was not derived from Māori traditions. The Toi, who lived in the Bay of Plenty, did so in the 13th to 15th centuries, according to local genealogies. Another Toi from Arawa tradition was contemporaneous with the Arawa canoe. There is no Maori story from any source that tells the Toi Whatonga story in the Smith sequence, or which places Toi in the 12th century. After Kupe, however, the second leg of the Great New Zealand myth was the epic journey of the Great Fleet. Here is the school journal version, read and taught over decades to hundreds of thousands of New Zealand children in primary schools and used as a basis for similar stories in a wide range of secondary literature. We shall now tell of the coming of the fleet. About 500 years ago, in the 14th century, a number of vessels set sail from island Polynesia for New Zealand, their crews wearied by the fierce intertribal wars in which they'd been constantly engaged, and glad to seek a more peaceful home in the fair land of Aotearoa, whose beauties had been so often described by voyagers who had visited it. The canoes in which they migrated, 7 in number, were the Horouta, Takitimu, Arawa, Aotea, Tainui, Matatua, and Mamari. Some of the canoes were specially built for the voyage. Giant trees were felled and were shaped and hollowed out by skilled and noted chiefs, with adzes made of greenstone taken from New Zealand by Ngāhue. All the vessels set out about the same time, the Takitimu being last to leave. After recounting the voyages of the individual canoes and the many setbacks and adventures that befell their crews, the narrative concludes, "Of the further movements of these immigrants it would be tiresome to tell, sufficient to say that they mingled with the Maoris already here and founded the great Maori race that occupied both the North Island and the South Island when the white man came. After the arrival of the fleet, canoe voyages between New Zealand and Polynesia became rare. We have now seen how the islands of New Zealand were discovered and peopled by a race which spread over the islands of the South Seas. Trimming their lateen sails to the trade winds, they explored the vast Pacific in primitive outriggers and cumbrous double canoes, probably the most daring and adventurous navigators the world has ever seen. Obeying the call of adventure and following the lure of Hini Moana, the ocean maid, they laid down countless sea roads and boldly faced the tempestuous open sea when few European sailors ventured to lose sight of land." As with earlier stories, this account too had been compiled by Stephenson Percy Smith, supposedly from Maori informants. It was another saga redolent of derring-do, which Pakeha New Zealanders were quick to embrace and add to the founding mythology of the nation as a whole. Maori too would have felt uplifted by the story's themes and accomplishments, and the fact that they were descended from such enterprising and courageous people. Inasmuch as it showed groups of Maori from different places and backgrounds acting together for the common good, the Great Fleet would also become a metaphor for kotahitanga, the fundamental unity of Maori origins and aspirations over and above tribal divisions. So taken were the first 2 generations of Maori educated to this tale that tribal leaders, Apirana Ngata, Te Puea Herangi, Maharaya Winiata, organised a series of hui in 1950 to celebrate the 600th anniversary of the arrival of the Great Fleet, which by this time had grown to 9 canoes. Alas, and again, as in the case of Kupe's deeds, the Great Fleet story proved to be without verifiable Maori foundations. David Simmons's extensive research of 19th century sources found that the fleet as a concept occurred only rarely in Maori tradition. One Ngāti Kahungunu tradition spoke of 6 trees being cut simultaneously for 5 canoes, and some Tainui and Arawa stories spoke of those canoes setting out together. But the remainder of the canoe traditions were of individual voyages, albeit sometimes linked to a knowledge of others, and Percy Smith had come up with his date of 1350 AD by simply averaging out a great number of unrelated genealogical lines from Matatua, which was said to have arrived 14 generations before 1900, to Aotearoa, which was calculated to have landed 26 generations before that date. As for the Moriori people, who, according to Smith and his colleague Elston Best, had come to New Zealand between Kupe and the Great Fleet and greeted Toi and Whatonga, the basis for their existence turned out to be even shakier. Moriori, according to, again, the School Journal, were a race inferior to the stalwart Maoris and were of Melanesian, not Polynesian origin. No one knows whence they came nor why they came. They were ocean waifs occupying 3 canoes that had been carried away by a storm from some island to the westward. As time rolled on, they increased in numbers until they occupied many parts of the island. They were slight in build and had dark skins, upstanding or bushy hair, flat noses and upturned nostrils. They had a habit of looking sideways out of the corners of their eyes and were an indolent and chilly folk who afterwards settled the Chatham Isles. In their new home they became peace-loving, timorous and lazy, and as hopelessly isolated as Robinson Crusoe on his island. Precisely who the Moriori of the Chatham Islands were and where they came from is dealt with in the following chapter. Suffice it to say now that almost everything said about them here, that they were Melanesian, that they preceded the ancestors of the Maori, that they were driven off the mainland to the Chatham Islands, that they were timorous and lazy, is demonstrably wrong. But for hundreds of thousands of New Zealand children, the version of Moriori history carried in the School Journal and other publications which drew from that source, reinforced over 60-odd years by primary school teachers, was the one that lodged in the national imagination. The great New Zealand myth, synthesized in the early years of the 20th century, was demolished in the last decades of the same century. The principal points of demolition were that the country had been settled far earlier than the 14th century date given for the Great Fleet Migration, circa 800 AD, became a consensus among prehistorians in the 1970s, that there had been no Moriori settlement from Melanesia, and that there had been no Great Fleet in 1350 AD. By the early 21st century, however, the pendulum of scholarly hypothesis was swinging back to a point closer to the great New Zealand myth. While the bulk of the New Zealand Maori founding population had clearly come from East Polynesia, there was some evidence of early contact with Fiji and West Polynesia. While the Great Fleet concept remained suspect, it became increasingly clear that a significant number of migration canoes had set out from an East Polynesian interaction sphere at about the same time. And that time, while probably not around 1350 AD, may have been within 100 years of that date, and considerably later than the dates which the first professional archaeologists in New Zealand had initially proposed. So the great New Zealand myth was, if not rehabilitated, at least credited with a renewed degree of plausibility. The story of the Polynesian settlement of New Zealand, assembled with the tools of modern scholarship, however, is more complex than the Percy Smith narratives, more difficult, and infinitely more interesting.